Hello and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications for PFLAG National, and I'm coming to you live today from lovely Los Angeles. Haven't felt any tremor since about 5 o'clock this morning, so all's well here. And as always, I'm really happy to introduce my good friend and colleague, Jean Marie Navetta, our Director of Learning and Inclusion. Hello, Jean Marie.
Hello from Palm Springs, Liz. It's good to see you. And
you
see you
too. Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. Welcome to Something to Talk About. Once again, we are back online and ready to have a chat. And today we're talking baseball, and I'm maybe promoting the Mets just a little bit because I can. But we are really going to talk about inclusion in sports overall. But I have two of my favorite people on the show with us today to have the conversation. So first, I'd like to bring in Billy Beane, who was MLB's first ever ambassador for inclusion and is now a VP and special assistant to the commissioner at Major League Baseball, also notably the second ever player to come out as gay. And I'd also like to introduce Kirk Walker, who is the assistant softball coach at UCLA, who helped bring the team to a 2019 national championship. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello, Jean Marie. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to see both of you. So for everybody who's joining us online, we are talking about inclusion in sports. And if you want to follow along with the article that we are using from The Advocate, that was written by David Artavia, you should go to straightforequality.org/discussion series, and you will be able to access that article and the questions that we are going to use for today's discussion. But for those of you who are joining us online, we definitely want to make sure that you are participating in the discussion. So please weigh in. So let's get the conversation going so I can stop talking. So the article really, I can't stop talking ever, really. So the article really focuses on the idea of more players coming out. And the specific article really focuses on Thomas Beattie's experiences. And he talked about why he waited until when he did to actually come out and what he is seeing in sports. So I want to just start with both of you, actually maybe Billy first and then Kirk. I want to talk about what has changed in sports that you think might be making it easier for players today to disclose about their identities, and in fact, is it getting better? So maybe Billy first, and then Kirk.
Okay. Well, I think it's great. First of all, it's great to see such an accomplished athlete like Thomas making the decision. I think he's a powerful role model, and that is probably the most important component when young athletes are seeing images that they can relate to, that they can look up to, and they can aspire to that success. I think it's worth noting that we don't have as many out athletes as at least in the major men's team sports that I think we probably expected 5 or 6 years ago or where we are now. But across the collegiate teams across the country, we're seeing ironically more soccer players come out, and I think that because when you do have someone that is successful, it has a strong impact. So in my opinion, I don't think you can, grade how sports is doing by the number of athletes that are out as much as the content in regard to diversity and acceptance and conversations about safe workplaces. And what teams, the messages and their values that they're putting out there. And I think that across the board, you're seeing exponential change over the last 4 or 5 years on that subject.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think Billy's spot on. I think the measure of whether the environment has changed is not how many athletes are out. I think there's a lot of layers of reasons why individual athletes may not come out or may not address it or may not deal with it. But I certainly think if you look across the board at the collegiate level, and obviously at the professional level as well, there is a completely different culture and environment that is, I think, is prepared and accepting of having LGBT individuals in sport. And we see it when athletes are coming out, coaches or administrators or people working in sports come out. We're seeing just overwhelming acceptance, and so we know that the culture is changing for sure.
I'd like to ask you both, so as more athletes do come out, and again, not looking necessarily at the numbers, but sort of at what those experiences are and what they cause, You certainly talked about having more openly LGBTQ athletes, but do you think that this has also made people who are not members of the LGBTQ community more aware of what's going on around them? Have you seen change in that area too?
I would say that we've seen tremendous amount of change. Sometimes change is hard for a fan who, a lot of times when there's progress and change, people find resistance to it because it's uncomfortable. It's something different. It's new. And I think for the influencers in this space, Kirk's a great example, the first coach to ever come out in Division I level as gay, and how he was moved right to the front as a leader in that space. People are looking for leadership, and the examples that are set, it's vitally important. I think where we're seeing a tremendous impact is people in the LGBTQ plus community looking to sport for as a possible profession. It doesn't have to mean that they're an athlete, but they, coaching or administrative levels, athletic directors. It's been something that I've really tried to focus on at MLB and our diversity hiring initiatives, to get the message out that there's a place for the best and brightest talent, whatever shape or size that comes in.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's certainly the culture and the environment is there. I think we're seeing that happening, and as we can have visible role models, I think it's tremendous and it's really important. I think one of the interesting things that Thomas even talked about in the article was, his lack of exposure through his growing up. He knew he was different, but he couldn't identify what it was. So even his inability to kind of know himself was prolonged because there wasn't a lot of role models, or there wasn't a lot of discussion in campuses or at school or at the family table on LGBT issues. So I definitely think when we start talking about visibility, it's really important. But visibility alone is only going to get us part way. I think we've got to make sure we're continuing to have those dialogues. We have the privilege of not sharing our sexuality, right? And so that's a privilege, and it's also a curse. And I think this generation, I will say this, and I'm sure Billy sees this as well, this generation is far ahead of us, of our generation and even our older generation. So we really owe it to them to catch up to where they are at, because we aren't really servicing where they are at in terms of dealing with their sexuality, because we're thinking that our experience was what they experienced, and it's not. It's very different.
It is a very different experience. Actually, what I would like to talk a little bit about what those experiences are. So one of the interesting things in the article is there's a pretty big discussion about the barriers to coming out. And certainly this point of getting to self-acceptance is definitely a big barrier for many people who are LGBTQ identified. But specific to athletes, could you both talk a little bit about what kind of barriers athletes face when it comes to being out athletes right now? What are they still grappling with?
I think the first thing any athlete in a team sport environment, or whether that's, you could be an individual on an Olympic team or something, but you want to feel that you have the respect and acceptance of your teammates, and the actual, just the physicality of walking into that locker room, that clubhouse, and know that you are accepted as an athlete. When I was a baseball player, the thought of changing that dynamic, I did not have that capacity. That was a long time ago, but I worked my whole life to be a Major League Baseball player, and I wanted to be viewed as that. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic that's different, as Kirk said, about this generation being smarter than we are, because they have had access to so much more information, so much faster, so much younger. But they, from my experience, that what I have seen, I feel like athletes that have decided not to come forward are much more secure in who and what they are. I think there was still so much I needed to find out about myself. I was afraid to tell my family. I was 2 years out of baseball before my parents even knew. I lost my partner, who died of HIV-related causes, who never met my family, and I never talked about him to anybody, because there was so much more for me to learn about myself. And I think that information, that allyship is out there, that friendship, that you can seek that and not compromise who and what you are in your professional life. And that goes for athletes as well.
Yeah, I'm feeding right off of that. I think there are many layers to it. Obviously, the self-acceptance is the first step, but when you're a part of a team sport, your whole existence is about elevating that team, moving that team forward, and it's not about drawing attention to yourself. If anything, you want to draw attention to yourself about, it's how you're contributing. So, a funny story. I mean, obviously, being LGBT is only a small part of who any one of us is. So, letting that become the largest talking point is really a disservice. And I think that's what a lot of athletes are fearful of, is that if I identify as LGBT, am I only going to be known as the gay athlete? And I no longer, my stats,
leading with that conversation. Not that it's not an important part, but that first time, it's hard to explain what it feels like to progress upward into the world-class level of athletic competition. And it's like in the article with Thomas, you could see him when he's sharing in his interview portion of the article that as an athlete, he said at the professional level, after he'd been a veteran, it's possible someone like him may have made that choice to come out at the end of his career had he not had a really, really serious head injury that shortened his career and took that, opportunity away from him. But, for taking the MLB into account, we have superstars that are 20, 21 years old. And if for any of the viewers here that identify as LGBTQ plus like me, I would challenge all of you to how emotionally evolved were you at 20 or 21? Just because you're a world-class athlete doesn't mean that you are a world-class at every part of your life. And it's an amazing accomplishment to have that part of your best self under control and be able to express 100% with confidence and love and have a supportive environment and family around you. But that's not always the case. And I think that until an athlete can define themselves with the life's work that it took to get there, I think a lot of times it's more of a business decision than it is a personal one. I really do.
Yeah, that's difficult. It is difficult. It's interesting, as you were both talking, I'm thinking about athletes who have disclosed about identities. And as I think about them, I think part of the reason I know them is specifically because of that, because the, gay or lesbian or bi or trans or whatever comes before their name. Kirk, are you seeing, because you're working with younger athletes, college level, are you seeing differences in some of the barriers that they're experiencing? Are you seeing less about self-acceptance, more about will I be accepted on a larger scale, or do some of those barriers look a lot the same to you?
Well, I think that the same barriers still exist, but I think they've kind of morphed a little bit. And I think we see self-acceptance probably a lot less of a barrier these days with the collegiate athletes. And part of that is, I think, as Billy intimated too, that there is so much more exposure and education at a younger age. I will say that the athletes don't like to be labeled. This generation doesn't want the label at all. So part of it is that they're self-accepting on who they are. They don't necessarily want to put a label on who they are. So they really kick back to what our generation is trying to kind of put people in boxes. And I think that's true not just in the LGBT world. I think that's true when it comes to religion. I think it's spirituality, even ethnicity. I think people don't want to be put in boxes. And so I think we're seeing that at the collegiate level. The interesting thing, obviously, where we see the greatest amount of gain to really happen is it was difficult when we were growing up. It was difficult to be in high school, right? You're trying to just fit in, right? I don't want to be drawn out on attention. I just want to fit in. So I'm going to mold. But really, Brene Brown talks about being able to find how you can belong versus fitting in. And I think that's a dialogue that really needs to be elevated at a younger level. It's hard to be in middle school these days with the pressures. And I think getting each individual to understand that's their differences and what they bring that really are what set them apart is what we need to be accelerating, and not necessarily trying to fit in just to fit in. And that's a hard thing when you're growing up, you're insecure. And so I think we see that still bleeding into generations later, and even at the professional level. People still want to fit in at some point in time.
Yeah. And that always still is, it's still a challenge, because it is always playing the game with who is around you at any given moment. What are their norms, and are you going to fit into their norms and their story? And that's scary for people, especially with so much to lose, when there's always a really good athlete right behind you sometimes.
And it's also important why it's so important that leadership leads with a culture of acceptance before putting that pressure onto one of their athletes. and as an individual. People, there was a thought that when Jason Collins came out and was active player in the NBA in 2014 for the last part of that season, that sport was the only accepting environment for LGBT athletes. It just so happened that Jason was in a perfect position to do it, and he has the makeup to take on that narrative. But it's more important from like that experience, but for the culture in the clubhouse, in the front offices, in the workplace protection laws, in schools. We started a Shred Hate bullying, anti-bullying prevention or bullying prevention program at MLB, and the conversations at elementary school level versus middle school versus high school are ultimately all different. But when you create an environment for a child that may not be ready to discuss the things that they're thinking about inside, but they're reminded consistently that they are accepted and one of something bigger, that's when we're going to start to see those athletes younger and younger feel like it doesn't matter, because it's been proven to them that it doesn't matter.
And the next step further is, once again, is that society-wise, and again, Thomas brought this up in the article, is until it's visible in society. And I'm not necessarily talking about an athlete, but in our history books, do we even talk about LGBT history in high schools and in elementary schools? So, we can figure out how to create a inclusive environment, but if you're still not seeing that LGBT individuals are normal, or whatever you want to use, if you want to use that term, or in the society as a norm, it doesn't matter how accepting society is, there's still another piece. And I think that's where we've got to challenge ourselves as leaders and as people who are a generation that's older, to understand it is not fair for us to put these individuals in saying, please come out, be accepting, but yet our history books talk nothing about LGBT. We have no examples. I'm not even talking about sports. I'm talking in government, politics, medicine, and music. They're all there, but we don't talk about them. We've seen the same
that do it.
We've seen this. Yeah, we've seen the same journey with, obviously the social justice on the racial side. It's the same exact story. Is that the history that we've been taught as kids is not necessarily accurate or valid in terms of all of the racial issues, and it's the same thing on the LGBT side.
And if you don't see yourself, it's hard to see yourself in different places and new places. I want to go to the last question, because I know we have some questions from the people who are watching today, and I saw a few of them come up and they're really good. But I want to ask, because we like to be really directive at PFLAG. We don't just like talking about things, we like doing things. So could you both talk about a little advice that you might have? So maybe could you both talk a little bit about what you would say to parents with their kids who are getting into sports and things that they should be doing, and maybe what coaches should be thinking about too, because I think those are 2 points where there are lots of opportunities for good input and frankly disastrous input too. So advice.
Coach Walker, you're up.
So this is an area that I'm very passionate about, and obviously I think the important conversation is not necessarily you have to talk about LGBT or about racial issues or religious issues. I think the biggest conversation is celebrating and talking about diversity being a strength of any organization, any family unit, or any society, and understanding it and valuing diversity. And that's where I start talking about the difference between fitting in and belonging. We've got to have those conversations about understanding that there are a diverse population, and that we need to understand and value that things look different. Being an ally these days isn't anything more than being a good person, in my opinion. Obviously PFLAG is an amazing organization, but being a good parent qualifies you to be in PFLAG, right? It's like, that's just being a good parent, right? Being supportive. I do think that where we need to push the envelope is not just talking about allies, because to me, ally is just about being a good person. Being an advocate is a whole different layer. And so I want to know where the LGBT advocates are, where the parents or the coaches or people that are advocates, not just allies. Because being an ally to me is a very baseline minimum, just being a good person. And if we can't establish that as the baseline, how are we ever going to take the conversation higher? Absolutely.
Billy, input.
So I think it's interesting when I saw the question pop up for us here, what do you do to support and encourage queer youth in sports? Now, is that the parents of those children, or are those the parents the teammates of those children as well. And I think
We'll take all parents.
Everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
It's every parent.
There's so much, there's a responsibility everywhere when you're trying to define. The beauty of sports is that it puts athletes in stressful situations and makes them problem solvers, and you get so used to. That's why you see so many dynamic personalities of people that have been successful in sports for a long, long time. And I'm such a proponent, whatever your child is interested in that has a physicality to it, that you promote that and endorse that and do whatever you can to get that. I mean, the biggest challenge, we have a tremendous program, RBI and play ball program in baseball that is all about youth initiatives, and one of the great priorities of our sport. The biggest challenge is getting kids outside. And so when you do, which is an accomplishment for those parents in this crazy busy world that we're in, to be able to support and take great solace in the fact that they're out there putting themselves in a position to be disappointed, to have a great moment of euphoria with a big win or a devastating moment with a loss, but have the parents keep that in perspective. Not everybody's going to be a major league athlete or be a Division I star on, in sports, but the way it shapes in the future. So I think it's kind of a fundamental answer to a big question. But for me, it's support the engagement, and diversity is the variety and the abilities and skills and cultural experiences of all your stakeholders or your athletes. And an inclusive environment is leveraging all those to get a superior product. And it's like, when you have a team made up of a bunch of different people, that's what an MLB clubhouse looks like now. And NCAA has become that as well, because they have global, recruiting, it seems like. But really, being a part of the process that is accepting and promoting the participation as much as living on the outcome, especially when they're young.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I wanted to kind of jump on top of that, because the coaching side, and I was asked when I first came out, is how am I coaching differently now that I'm out? And I must have looked like this at them. I'm like, coaching differently. And the whole component I've always talked to my team about the diversity in our team, our skill sets, the diversity in our personalities, the diversity in our mindsets, in our sense of humor is what's going to make us stronger. So that anytime we're going to face adversity as in a sport, we're going to face a pitcher, we're going to face an environment that's going to hit us in a certain way. And if we all responded the exact same way, then we're vulnerable, because that means that one person that can stop one of us is going to stop all of us. That doesn't make us as strong as a team. So the analogy that I think that whenever I'm talking to coaches is, we have to understand that talking about diversity is not just talking about racial issues or gender issues or gender identity. That's not diversity. Diversity is that every one of us come with a different set of strengths and weaknesses as an individual. And those differences need to be celebrated, because that's what puts us at our best. And that to me is a dialogue that has always occurred. It didn't change when I came out, but everyone thought it was going to be different. So.
And I think that's a really big point about understanding this goes beyond any one category. And actually, we have a ton of questions. We're only going to get to a few of them. So I'm going to ask Liz if she will come back in, because I think there's even more to talk about. Liz, help us. People are talking.
I can't believe you're inviting me into a space to talk about sports, but I'm going to do my best.
You're welcome. We welcome the diversity of sports knowledge. It's all good.
I feel welcome as an advocate and an ally. So one question that came up here from Melissa, I'm going to bring it up, about, we were talking about ways to make more accepting spaces, right? About whether having elite athletes, prominent athletes, making themselves more known as being out within the youth, cohort of athletes, would that help create a more accepting space?
Well, this is where I'll say on the youth side, it's a challenge, because even at the pro level, I think anytime we ask the LGBT individual to carry the weight on their shoulders to be responsible for an entire gender or sexuality is absolutely irresponsible. So I don't know that it's just about one individual being more visible. What I do think is that if an individual is confident and strong in who they are, their visibility does matter. But I don't think that we should be looking for those individuals to escalate the conversation. It's the other 85, 90% of our culture that needs to have in the conversation. Black Lives Matter is not about just African-American individuals talking, right? It's the same thing on ours. We can't put it all upon that Jason Collins comes out, therefore he's going to carry that on his shoulders for everybody. That's just irresponsible of us.
It's about leadership from the top down, and depending on the athletes to carry that message is just it's putting too much pressure on them, and that's why it's not happening. But we're moving in the right direction if leadership stays at the front.
I will say I like what you talked about. I think you both talked about it. This whole concept of talking about LGBTQ history in school, talking about Black history in school. I also think it's the importance of talking about LGBTQ individuals in relation to other moments in history where they just participated and were visible. I see a thing going on online where people are talking about, when was the first time you had a Black teacher? Like, that matters. When was the first time you had a gay coach? It's just living and being a part of the thing you're already a part of. Normalizes. I hate that word, but normalizes.
I know. I used it too. I don't like it.
Yeah. We do have another question here, which I thought was really interesting here, about how you think the conversation changes when you look at women's sports. And I'm going to follow that up. There's a follow-up to that someone else was wondering about women and athletes having this sort of different history and perception.
Yeah, and again, another conversation that I enjoy that is really interesting, because there is homophobia in both men's and women's sports. The difference is that if you were a female and got involved in sports, you're assumed lesbian, right? That's kind of that's the norm. That's the expected. So female athletes have grown up for the last 50 years of actually trying to combat, that stereotype, because the percentage that are LGBT are no different than regular society. But there was a stigmatism that if you were a female and you were in sports, you must be a lesbian. On the male side, you were assumed straight if you were in sports. So both of them have completely different journeys through this homophobia. One of them is very internalized. One of them is a little bit more externalized. So I do think that it's a different story. In women's athletics, I will say when I first came out at the coaching ranks, the biggest kickback that I got was not from football coaches or basketball coaches or straight coaches that I knew. They were all great and wonderful and accepting and excited. It was the LGBT women coaches, female coaches that were out there that kept saying, why are you talking about this? Don't rock the boat. We don't need to talk about this.
Wow.
And they were happy being out in their personal life and separate than their professional life. And I said, that's not fair to our student athletes. Our student athletes on the male side grow up with, Lute Olson being the coach and his wife baking cookies and showing up every event and traveling on the road trip. But for the female athletes that have a female coach that might have a female partner, and that female partner is separated out and never seen, what is that message we're sending to female athletes? That you can't be gay and be in sports, even if it's somebody that was quote unquote out in their personal life. So really different experiences.
Like not saying is actually the message, and that's the problem.
It's a very strong message. I also believe that's a big issue of why there's been a lot of women, the change in numbers of percentages of female coaches. I think there's a lot of women that are growing up saying, I don't want to do that. I'm going to be out. I don't want to be separated. So I do think that we've seen a lot of women that might have gone into coaching that go a different direction. So I do think that there's a lot of tentacles to that.
That was a great question. So we only have 2 minutes left. I wonder if you have final parting thoughts.
I would love one last parting thought from each of you. Something for people to take away and think about and do next.
Well, I think the visibility, and I want to say what a great education partner PFLAG is, and Jean Marie, you are the heart and soul of that to MLB, and in our efforts to familiarize our athletes with LGBTQ history, understanding what being an ally is, and understanding what engagement is, and all that. So there's baseball allowed for me to create a platform that has been a very effective way to change a narrative that used to be acceptable and it no longer is. So these types of conversations are so powerful and so important, and I really appreciate the invitation. Kirk is not only a great friend of mine, but just a tremendous influencer across NCAA sports, and I've enjoyed watching him, change minds and bring people together. And we're all part of the process. So conversations like this are wonderful. So thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you, Billy. Kirk.
I concur. I'm so honored to be on this call and be on the call with Billy and with yourself and with Liz. And PFLAG is an amazing organization that continues to be, I think, the leader, because I think when we start talking about parents and growing our kids up, being good parents is really where it really comes from. So I think PFLAG is one of the most amazing organizations that crosses over a lot of barriers, because being a parent is really a powerful unifier. And I do agree. I think the times have changed. I think times are changing. We need to get on the right side of history, and we need to make sure that we, as leaders right now and an older generation in sports, do a better job of serving the next generation that's coming. I think we are not fully there yet in serving what we can do for them.
Well,
thank you for having me.
Friend. You are both huge figures in changing what is happening, and I'm so honored to know you and to work with you, and I want to thank you for being with us here today, and hope you're going to come back and talk again, and we'll keep this conversation going. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean.
And to everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us again. We will be back next week, same bat time, same bat channel. We are talking Puerto Rico next week, so you definitely want to be here. So we will wrap up the way we wrap up every week with the advice of the doctor to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And please continue wearing your masks, because we want to see you around. Please join us back again next Thursday for something to talk about. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. Visit us at pflag.org to learn more about PFLAG. Have a great week.